And Deborah, before I introduce you and give your bio, I just want to welcome you to the show. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's a treat. Deborah is quite talented. I won't spend long minutes on her bio, but she's an expert on the topic we're talking about today, free speech and national security, which are issues that Act for America is focused on. She has particular expertise on the Islamist stifling of speech here in America and, quite frankly, around the world. We've had speakers like Elizabeth Savage-Wolf, who is an advocate there in Austria, who's personally faced this challenge. So Ms. Weiss and Elizabeth are very good friends and familiar with each other. And Deborah is also an attorney and was an attorney for the Giuliani administration in New York and for the Committee on the House Oversight in Congress. She is an author, contributed to a number of books, and her most recent book is entitled The Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Jihad on Free Speech. And her articles appear across the internet, on National Review Online, The Weekly Standard, Washington Times, American Thinker. She's a regular contributor to Front Page Magazine and the David Horowitz wonderful website, and many others, Robert Spencer, and great friends of Stephen Coughlin, and who we had on last week, which is one of the reasons why we had Deborah on. We want to continue the theme that Stephen talked about last week in talking about the assaults on our free speech. And Deborah, again, I want to open up with a topic, the general topic. Sometimes we kind of forget what is the importance, and we have a lot of young people who may not understand really the importance of free speech to us. Talk a little bit about just the overview and remind us all of why that's important.
It is important, Roy, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because if you do have young people in your audience, I suspect they're not really learning this at their universities today. But freedom of speech is considered a foundational underpinning for our entire democracy. It's necessary for human rights, for religious freedom, and national security. Without it, we wouldn't be able to have political dissent, you wouldn't be able to pray the way you want to, and we wouldn't have accurate national security either. So it's very important. That's why it's in our First Amendment, and that's why it's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it underlies everything. But we're losing it. We're losing it now. I will also say, since you mentioned what goes on in Europe, is that America is very unique in the First Amendment. We are the freest country in the world regarding speech. Even Europe doesn't have the kind of free speech we have. Most of the countries there have, if not all, have hate speech laws or denigration of a recognized religion. There are certain laws that restrict speech. Over there, that sometimes you can't have group offense. You can't say bad things about groups. They kind of balance freedom of speech with the right not to be offended, and we don't have any of that here.
Exactly, and I alluded to a little bit about the colleges and our young people. We're seeing this on the college campuses. I know we had this discussion offline about safe spaces and microaggressions and all these new terms that are being attached to what we would consider just in the 60s and 70s. You could say, that was the hallmark of our, the pushback among college students was that freedom of speech was what it's all about, and yet we've gone 180. Your thoughts about that comments and why?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I actually teach in some colleges as a guest lecturer or a substitute lecturer, and it is shocking that these places call themselves institutions for higher learning, and yet people have to have trigger warnings for ideas. I mean, what is the point in going to college if you're not going to expose yourself to different ideas? And the safe spaces, the trigger warnings, I've seen surveys where they'll say a high percentage of students, even at Ivy League and very prestigious universities, believe that there should be speech restrictions so that other people don't get offended. And I want to be clear when we do this show, Roy, that the reason I advocate for freedom of speech isn't because I'm a champion of bigotry. That is not the point. The point is it is a package deal, and in order to have the best ideas in this country win, you have to be able to have a free exchange of ideas. In the war of ideas, you have to, if somebody doesn't like what you say, they are free to say why what you're saying is wrong, to criticize it, or to have their own event. But it's really bad when you're going to have people deciding that they can't even hear other viewpoints or that they find other viewpoints offensive. And who is going to be the person that decides what are the ideas you can talk about and what are the ideas that you can't? It's very dangerous.
Well, you used a couple of terms there. I know you're in the academic world, but if I hear the word trigger phrase or whatever.
Trigger warnings.
Trigger warning. I think in terms of a gun, hey, don't put your finger on the trigger unless you want to use it.
Right.
But that's not what you're talking about. Tell us some of the definitions that the colleges have placed on them and why, again, this is just part of this new lingo we use to inhibit or create this obstruction of free speech.
Well, I mean, they're just called trigger warnings. They'll just have sometimes it happens a lot of times when there are conservative speakers, or they'll just put flyers up saying trigger warning, this is, whatever. It's going to, I don't know what the things are that they would put in the flyers after that, but they give them a warning that it might trigger some emotional response or get you upset. And then sometimes they'll have therapy sessions. I've even heard they'll have therapy sessions for the students afterwards if they're upset. But in terms of the language manipulation, I mean, that's a whole other thing that we can talk about with the whole push from the Islamists to stifle speech.
Deborah and Roy, all I can say in regard to that is shame on the parents of those young people. They needed to jerk them out of their short pants and their little girl bloomers a long time ago. That's developing a generation of people. They can't think for themselves, and they're detrimental to themselves and the rest of society.
But that's that sadly is the element that we're faced with. But again, be that as it may, we're faced with that, and we have this effort. And we always want to kind of go to the roots. Where does this start?
Think about that because as I'm sure you know, the colleges have really now become indoctrination centers.
Right.
They're liberal indoctrination centers rather than educational centers. And instead of, as you said, I don't know if you said the 60s or the 70s, where they encouraged freedom of ideas and debate and discussion, they're now acting to stifle it.
Exactly. So I think it is interesting. But again, these students of the 60s and 70s who wanted this liberation are now the college professors, the heads of the departments, and many others within the administration. And they realize that they can't compete on the arena of ideas. So what do? You limit those ideas. You put labels on them. And therefore, and for unknowing and unwitting students who don't know any better, who would look up to their college professors, then they assume that, oh, well, this is just stuff in Iowa I wasn't aware of. I didn't realize people would get offended out of this, so I guess I better be quiet or I shouldn't say this. So who would you say, or who are the groups that are kind of behind this movement? And we talked a little about the education movement, but there are other groups outside of the education arena.
Well, free speech is being attacked from all different quarters, Roy. So what I was talking about with the schools was mostly, what I'll just say, the PC, politically correct crowd. The leftists are very sympathetic to freedom of speech. But my area of specialty is the Islamic organizations that have a push to stifle free speech, specifically on the issue of Islam. They don't want any criticism of Islam, and they don't want Islam or Muslims being shown in a negative light. And I want to be clear when I talk about this, Roy, that I am not by any means indicting all people who call themselves Muslim. I want to make the distinction between Muslims, who are people, and Islam, which is an idea. So the ideas are, people don't want the ideas to be discussed or criticized either. And that would be true whether we're talking about Islamic terrorism or Islamic persecution of Christians in the Middle East, or Islamic human rights violations, or the Islamic treatment of second-class treatment of women. And the groups that are pushing this are the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which I wrote a whole a little book on, a monograph.
Right.
And they're doing it in the UN, and with UN resolutions that are not legally binding, but they're important because countries sign on to them, and it shows support for the ideas contained in the resolutions. And if they are passed repeatedly, at some point they do run the risk of being deemed international law. But more importantly, it's a mechanism by which to get countries to accept those ideas and at some point export the ideas into their own countries in the form of domestic law. So I would say the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is doing it on a legal international level. Muslim Brotherhood front groups like Council on American Islamic Relations or MPAC or the Muslim Students Association, which is on almost every chapter, almost every campus they have a chapter, ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, and there's a whole slew of others. And they also push to stifle free speech in a whole myriad of ways here in America and then also in Canada. And they do it by pressuring people, by shaming them, by by calling them names. You're a bigot, you're a racist. I mean, how is saying something bad about Islam racist? Islam's not a race. It's an ideology. It's a religion. So that's their. And by the way, I'm writing a book now on the Islamist influence in Hollywood. So they're having an impact on our culture through movies. They're trying to censor movies, that you should never have a Muslim terrorist in a movie because then you're a bigot. So that's the second group, I'd say. We have the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Muslim Brotherhood front groups, and then, of course, there's the terrorists, which it's not their primary goal, but as you saw, even if you look around the world at Charlie Hebdo in Paris and all over the place, when somebody commits Islamic blasphemy or shows a cartoon of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, then one way to get them to stop speaking is to kill them.
Right. And we've had two instances involving our chapter here in San Antonio to give the audience, to bring it back to a local level. In San Antonio, we meet at several different facilities. One is a church, Village Parkway Baptist Church, but we've also met at a Jewish synagogue there in San Antonio, and we were very honored to have Rabbi Scheinberg host us there at Rofei Shalom Synagogue. Well, in the course of one of our meetings where we were going to talk about alternate energy sources, CARE put out a big press release, brought the press in and said, we believe that, you, Rabbi Scheinberg, should shut down and not allow these haters to be allowed into your synagogue because of the Southern Poverty Law Center says they're haters and we say they're haters. And as I responded to the media when they came, I said, we're talking about alternate energy sources tonight. I'm thinking that anyone would want to figure out how to do that. And they attempted to, but fortunately Rofei Shalom and Rabbi Scheinberg stood up for us and said, no, we're going to have this meeting and do that. And then we had another event in which we were supposed to appear on board with another speaker at St. Mary's University, and there was an FBI representative who was supposed to be on there. Well, CARE heard that we were going to be on there, wrote to the FBI and complained that we were going to be on there making a presentation along with some other scholars, and the FBI withdrew their expert from the event, and we were disinvited because of that. Now it turned out to be a good thing, because we had Claire Lopez and John Guandola came out a month later. Instead of having them for an hour and a half, we had them for 6 hours. So God works in great ways. So
next week I'm going to be speaking and with somebody else, and we are not publicizing the event at all for the reasons you just said. It's pathetic that. So CARE is really the main organization that does this in terms of targeting speakers, and I also wrote a whole book on them called Council on American Islamic Relations, Its Use of Lawfare and Intimidation, published by Citizens for National Security, if anyone's interested.
Sure. Give us that. I mean, I've talked a little bit about them, periodically, but as someone who's written extensively about this, in the next few minutes, go into a little more depth into them and tell us why people need to be informed about them and their threat to freedom of speech, but also other areas.
Well, CARE holds itself out as a Muslim civil rights organization, but in fact, it's a Muslim Brotherhood front group. It has a lot of terrorist ties. It spawns out of Hamas and the Islamic Association of Palestine, both of which are state-designated terrorist organizations. And by the way, CARE itself is designated as a terrorist organization in the UAE. So what they have a lot of leadership that are in jail and from different chapters, and they'll try to tell you, oh, it's just one bad apple, and we can't control everybody. But if you really study them, it's a pattern. It's not a coincidence, that they arose out of Islamic terrorist groups, that they have leaders who wind up in jail, convicted on charges from helping material support or, just various terror-related charges. And they basically, I'd say, have three main goals. I mean, they're not going to come out and say it like this, but if you study their actions, one is to protect Islam from so-called defamation. They do say that. We're protecting Islam from defamation. So let me just go off on a little tangent and explain to your audience what that means. In America, we have defamation laws, and defamation is when you make a false statement of fact, and you do it with some level of intent or recklessness, and it causes some kind of harm to somebody. I mean, if you say an opinion, it doesn't matter how bad it is, because you're entitled to your opinion. If you say something bad about somebody, no matter how bad it is, if it's true, and it's a factual statement, but it's true, that's obviously also allowable. So if you say something that's false but factual, like if you say somebody stole $5,000 of mine, so don't hire them, but they never did steal anything and they're really an honest person, that is defamation. So they're taking that word and they're using it in a totally different manner. Really, what they mean by it is don't commit Islamic blasphemy. Don't criticize Islam. Don't show Islam in a negative light. Even if it's true, you can't do it because it's offensive. You can't talk about Islamic terrorism. They'll deny that there is such a thing. If you insist that there is, then you're a bigot, you're a racist, and they're going to protect Islam from defamation by censoring movies, books, stories, shutting down speakers, purging national security training material, which has been done under this administration.
Which makes this Sharia compliant, which is what they're forcing everyone to submit to, a Sharia compliant world.
Well, what's happening here?
People say that, Roy, but I prefer not to word it so broadly because, that is their goal. Ultimately, the goal of all of these groups is to have one nation, the Nation of Islam, no territories for other countries, with an Islamic caliphate and worldwide Sharia law. But Sharia law is implemented through the government by force of law. It's not just a religion, it's a political ideology, And Sharia blasphemy laws, yes, they are trying to get Sharia, the idea of Sharia implemented in stages. So first we'll have self-censorship, then we'll have politically correct policies, then we'll have guidelines, then we'll move on to laws. I mean, you can't just come in a country like this or even in Europe and say, hey, let's have Sharia blasphemy laws. But they're working towards.
No, that's right. And we're going to talk about that in the second hour, HR 569, so it's a teaser. And there are some representatives here in Texas, in San Antonio specifically, that are in support of a bill that all of you should be concerned with. We're speaking today with Deborah Weiss. She's an expert on free speech and national security and related issues. She's particularly an expertise in Islamic stifling of speech, which is what we've been talking about. She's been an attorney with the Giuliani administration, written numerous books. You can reach out to her at vigilancenow.org. If you wish to contact her, write to vigilancenow.org, and you can get more information and follow her. All of her writings, they're great stuff. We're coming up to the last 3.5 minutes of this segment. Deborah, go ahead.
Well, for this, I'll just finish answering the question about what you said CARE is trying to do.
Right.
So one of them was to protect Islam from defamation. The other is to Islamize the workplace. They file a lot of lawsuits under the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, trying to get special preferences for Muslims, whether it's prayer times in the workplace or break times that other people might not get, or they should get priority. You know, all kinds of things like that. Those cases usually settle. They don't usually go to court. CARE sues quite a bit, and they know they can't win. So it's just a tactic to intimidate people. So, and then the third goal that they have is to hamper our national security. There is not a single national security measure that they're okay with. Every time our Congress tries to pass a law or does pass a law that would potentially protect us from Islamic terrorism, they go out on a campaign talking about how the measure targets Muslims, quote, unfairly, or it's Islamophobic, racist, bigoted, and they try to undermine it. So I would say those are the three goals.
Lance?
Well, we're going to have more discussion when we come back. Deborah, I have some questions I'm going to present to you as soon as we come back. Welcome back, folks. It's the God Family Country Show. We are back, and I want to thank you all for hanging in there for the news break. We have Deborah Weiss with us right now and Roy White. And Deborah, can you hear me okay right now?
I can.
Okay, I have a couple questions for you because listening to the first, 30 minutes or so of our conversation that you've been having, this reminds me so much of what happened in China under Mao and in Russia under Stalin and in Germany under Hitler and any other dictatorship that takes place. The first thing you do is you take away their weapons and you take away their speech. You take away their freedom of speech so that they can't have any dissent. When people can't argue or can't voice a different view than what the other person's view is, then you've eliminated the opportunity of dissent. And that's exactly what they're trying to do with from Islam in our country right now by trying to change our laws and our rules on First Amendment rights. And all I can say is every time we back up from CARE, no matter who the organization is, if we take a different path, then we're submitting to CARE and we're becoming an underground operation. Not that Act for America is doing that, because Roy keeps trying to find a way, to keep pushing forward through them. But we can't let that happen. We cannot lose our freedom of speech. We don't dare lose the First Amendment rights. And I say it in the first hour all the time. Parents, ask your children, ask your grandchildren what they're learning in college and in the universities and even in your elementary schools. If you're being told that the First Amendment is abusive, that freedom of speech is abusive, it's time as parents that you start taking control of the situation, look into it, and start acting against it. You have to take the defense measures right there at home. If it even means taking your children and grandchildren out of the universities and colleges.
Well, Lance, here's the word that they use when we were doing the review for the social studies textbooks, is they want to use the word a living document. The Constitution is a living document. That allows them to begin to play around with the edges and to make introductions instead of letting you don't end up tweaking the foundation on your house. You don't end up drilling into that and just willy-nilly nailing things into the wall if it's in the foundation of the house. So we have to begin to, just like you said, as parents and grandparents and concerned citizens. And again, we're here today educating folks, and we're fortunate to have Deborah Weiss, who's an expert on free speech and national security, specifically how the Islamists have been stifling speech. Deborah, one of the scariest things is that when you begin to have congressmen and legislators get involved in this whole issue, and you actually have that developing and has here in the United States in Congress. Is that not correct?
Yes, it is. I mean, everything Lance said is true, but they will never overtly say, oh, we think the First Amendment is dangerous. They'll just start talking about don't insult anybody and have the phrases that they use, like that the OIC uses, and you hear it increasingly on the left as well, is we have to have responsible speech. We have to have sensitive speech. So we believe in free speech, but, and if you don't mind me saying it this way, I know you have a Christian audience, but everything before the but is bull. So, when they say we believe in free speech, but before you know it, they're trying to say hate speech isn't free speech. And we are now in a situation where when there is a new Supreme Court justice, because as you see, it's a divided court. It's not so clear all the time. This is what our laws are supposed to be under the Constitution. We can't even agree in the Supreme Court. So if we get a left-leaning Supreme Court, I am very concerned that our freedom of speech will gradually be chipped away at. It's being chipped away at now, as you said, on a congressional level, not from a legally binding point of view, but it's very clear that the people who sit in that office do not understand what free speech is or why it's important, either that or they don't care. Recently there was a bill, House Resolution 569, condemning violence and bigotry against anti-Muslim speech in the United States, and 145 out of 188 Democrats co-sponsored that bill. That is where we are now.
And you say that, and I just looked at the bill this morning. You're exactly correct. That is the number of people who have, a number of Democrats, no Republicans have signed on. And interesting enough, go through this before, and as everyone listens to Deborah talk about this, think about District 35. If you live along the I-35 corridor between San Antonio and Austin, you are living in a district represented by Lloyd Doggett. He is in support of what Deborah is about to explain to you, of what that bill really means and how it has some roots going to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and CARE and others. So, Deborah, if you'd expound upon that bill a little bit more, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll explain it briefly, and just so your audience knows, I also wrote an article about it, so it's short and easy to understand, called Democrats Castigate Free Speech. If you look up my name and Democrats Castigate, it'll come up in Front Page Magazine, and it's about this bill. The bill was called Condemning Violence, Bigotry, and Hateful Rhetoric Towards Muslims in the United States, which, first of all, why are we selecting Muslims? Is there a group that doesn't have hateful rhetoric hurled at them? How about Jews, blacks, women? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Try being white.
Bill like this. But the main thing is they're conflating violence and speech, and they do this all the time. This is a tactic that the Islamists use. The left, the people on the far left are joining with that. I believe they're doing it on purpose. I don't believe it's by accident or by negligence. They're conflating violence with speech. And that's where our laws draw the divide. The divide is you can say whatever you want, but you can't assault somebody. You can't commit battery. However, they throw it all in one sentence throughout the entire bill. They assert that Muslims are victims of hate crime, which is also ridiculous because if you look at the actual FBI statistics, even with CARE submitting false reports, which is what they do, by the way, But and you can. There have been people who've documented that. For example, there was a case where there was a little store owner, and there was a fire there, an arson, and they included that. But when they did the investigation, he's the one who committed the arson to get the insurance. It was an insurance fraud case, but CARE still submitted it as a hate crime, even though he did it to himself. So those are the kinds of things they do. But Jews have much more violence against them, and they're very low. I'm not saying they don't get any, but all groups get some. And
the 2014 statistics from the FBI they released is Jews were 64%, and I think the Muslims was 4 times less than that, so around the 13.
Right. So they're painting them as victims, and also especially, and they always, the other thing they do, Roy, is they always seem to come out with these kinds of statements is when there's an Islamic terrorist attack.
Yeah.
After Orlando, after San Bernardino, after what happened in Texas, the first thing they're always worried about is, quote, backlash against Muslims, right? Like, this is the important thing. First of all, it's conjured up. It's largely conjured up for political purposes because victimhood sells. So if they can, convince you that that they're a victim, then you're more likely to be sympathetic with their anti-freedom political messages and their whole agenda. So they'll say, the other thing is they'll say that it actually says that hate speech is contrary to the founding principles of religious freedom, which I find hilarious if it wouldn't be so pathetic. First of all, I just want to point out to you, I'm not saying this because I'm a partisan. I'm saying this because this is a fact. Anybody can go look this up on LOC.gov. You type in HR 569 LOC.gov, that's libraryofcongress.gov, where they track all the bills in Congress, the actions that were taken, who supports them, what the bill says. Not one Republican signed onto the bill, not one. So I find it hilarious that the Democrats are all of a sudden worried about the founding principles. As you said, they believe in the living, breathing document, but here they're using that language of the founding principles to say that it's against religious freedom. But you know what? If your religion is really a political ideology, sure, you can pray 5 times a day, you can wear your hijab, but if your political ideology infringes on our freedom of speech or any other freedom that's in the Constitution, then it's not allowed. It's not allowed, and you can't use our religious freedom to stifle our freedom of speech, and that is what they're doing. So,
well, I want to go off on a tangent here real quick, but simply, Lance, imagine if in Jesus' time, he would have been considered a hate speech because the way he spoke about the Jewish, leaders there, he was talking about the rituals and how they were not in tune with what, at least Christianity was all focused on.
Oh, and he made them very angry, Roy. I mean,
Oh, absolutely. They needed a safe space.
Yeah, they needed a safe space with a little room with dolls in it,
Yeah, that's right. So I just put that in our biblical terms because, telling the truth can never be considered hate speech. And I believe that
they're doing.
Well, exactly.
That's what they're doing.
Exactly. So I think that's what we have to stand firm for. And, again, Deborah, Lloyd Dockett, who's here in District 35, I hope our listeners who are either in that district or know of people who are in that district, write to him and ask him why is he supporting that bill, or write to us at Act for America at ActBear, ActBeXAR at Reagan.com, and we'll help you prepare and get you the information so you can begin to put pressure on him to remove his name from this bill. And we have 5 others here in the state of Texas. Beto O'Rourke from District 16 out in El Paso, who's a young guy who supports it. And then we have, no surprise, Bernice Johnson in Dallas, Al Green there in Sugar Land and Pearland, Representative Ruben Hinoso in District 15, which is in the southern portion out toward Guadalupe and Hidalgo in Karnes County, Wilson County. So those folks who listen to us down in Floresville, you should really be pushing back against him. And then
who's the one in Wilson County?
Ruben Hinoso, District 15, Hinojosa. I mean, And then Sheila Jackson Lee in Houston, no surprise there. And as yeah, she's represent
a lot of money from Muslim Brotherhood front groups.
In Houston, it has one of the largest, as well as in the Bernice Johnson area, a large Muslim community there, strong, outspoken. So yes, there's definitely money to be made in touting a bill like this, and you only show your true colors to the Islamists who say, hey, thank us for shutting down those who wish to tell the truth. We don't want that to occur.
Roy, what's that bill? What's that bill again?
Doing with it is they're claiming, they're all making this claim now that anti-Muslim, what they're calling anti-Muslim or anti-Islam rhetoric, causes terrorism.
Right.
Obama has said it. The people on the left. By the way, I just want to be clear. That bill doesn't have any legally binding content.
Right. It's a resolution.
First of all, it's never going to pass as long as Republicans are in Congress. It's not even going to the floor for a vote. But it shows you, and it doesn't prohibit it. It just condemns it. But I pointed out to show you where the mindset of the left is and how high-ranking that ideology goes. The other thing they're doing is they're claiming that the anti-Islam rhetoric causes terrorism, which is obviously ridiculous. If that's what true tolerance is you have a debate, a discussion, or ignore it. The only thing that causes terrorism is when you choose to commit an act of terror, and it's part of the Judeo-Christian values to have personal responsibility. So this whole idea eschews Judeo-Christian values and shifts the responsibility from the actor who's committing terrorism to the person who is saying something that you might not like, even if it's true.
Well,
so
it's the same.
The other thing about it is I don't want to end the show without mentioning something about the enemy threat doctrine, which is under national security extremely important and dictates that in order to win a war, you have to know two things. One is you have to know who you are, and two is you have to know who your enemy is and be able to name him by name. If you don't do that, you're not going to win. It's very similar to any problem you have in life. If you deny its existence, how are you ever going to come up with a strategy to defeat it? So the Muslim groups, the Muslim Islamic supremacist groups, are trying to stifle the speech for two reasons. One is it makes, as you pointed out, makes you comply with their Islamic blasphemy laws. And I'm wording it that way rather than, obviously, we don't have the criminal punishments where people are beheaded and all of that, but it does make you comply with the Islamic blasphemy laws. But two is it also gives them a, quote, safe space where now that you don't know what's going on, they can further their plans and their strategies to engage in terrorism and also anti-freedom measures, whatever political, legislative, social, or cultural advances they need to incrementally inch along the lines toward having an Islamic caliphate without you even being able to discuss it. Because if you discuss it, then you are a racist, a bigot, and an Islamophobe. So part of the strategy by obfuscating the speech is to fog the war, to make it so you don't know what's going on. You know, if you've ever read Orwell, you'll understand the importance of words. Words represent ideas. They are trying to change the definitions of words, blur the definitions of words, stamp out your usage of certain words, and the reason is so that those ideas will be confusing to you or maybe even non-existent because you won't have a label for it.
We're speaking with Deborah Weiss. She's an expert on free speech and national security, specifically on how the Islamists have been stifling speech. She's an author of the book, The Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Jihad on Free Speech. Her articles appear regularly in the American Thinker, National Review Online, Weekly Standard. You can get more information on her by going to her website at vigilancenow.org and visit there, and you can contact her. She has a way to get in touch with her there. Lance, you were going to say something?
Well, yeah. What's that bill again? Let's get that bill out. And first of all, and you know, like Deborah was saying, Stephen Coughlin said the same thing. You change the lexicon of the language, and suddenly you have control of the people because they don't know what their language is. Therefore, they can't identify their enemy.
It's H.R. 569, H.R. House Resolution 569. And as Deborah said, HB would be a bill that would have the force of law. Resolutions do not. So HR 569 does not have that, but our listeners can go and learn more about that. Probably, I don't want to leave the show without giving you an opportunity to probably talk about the word that most people hear when they hear this term, and this is the word Islamophobia. And we've kind of been talking around it, but give us the history of this and why it's important for people to know this.
Well, Islamophobia is actually a word that a lot of people trace it back to the Muslim Brotherhood, but it actually started before then with the Runnymede Trust. However, it came into more popular usage with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood front groups, and it was made for the purpose of stifling criticism of Islam. People assume that Islamophobia means bigotry in the same vein as racism or sexism, and they don't really ask, what does it mean? Well, first of all, phobia is an irrational fear, right? It's actually something, if you really have it, if you have a phobia of snakes or agoraphobia, you're afraid to go outside, you go to a therapist to try to overcome your irrational fear. I mean, I don't think there's anything irrational about being afraid of an ideology that in its full-blown expression is going to wind up killing you and destroying your society and your culture. So, but second of all, if you actually look at how the Muslim Brotherhood front groups and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation apply that word, you will see that it's not applied in a limited way when there are bigoted or prejudicial comments or acts made. It's applied in a way that we discussed before, that anything that's true, that's negative, the same way defamation of religion. In the end, all interpreted the same way. So if it's hate speech against Islam, is the same as defamation, the same, and if you do it, you're an Islamophobe. So they're trying to say that they use it in a very manipulative way, actually, saying that you should be tolerant. You should be, well, why should you be tolerant of having a group that wants special preferences, that wants to stifle your freedom of speech, that wants to hamper your national security? And I'm not talking about the people even. Although I'm talking about just discussing the ideas. If you wanted a panel, they'll deny that there's any association of Islam with terrorism, even though every time there's an Islamic terrorist attack, the terrorists preface it by saying Allahu Akbar, right? But they'll deny that there's any connection to it. And if you want to have a panel, for example, of national security experts to discuss not even the assumption and the understanding that there's Islamic terrorism, but can we just have a debate and question it? Is there such a thing? Well, you can't do that because then you are an Islamophobe and a racist. And as I said, they're working very hard on some local bodies, governmental bodies, and also in the UN. They're trying very hard to get it deemed as racism. And, the reason we have laws against racist comments and bigotry against racism is because it's an immutable characteristic. It's something that's genetic, it's physical. There's nothing you can do about it, and there's nothing wrong with it. So you are a bigot if you discriminate against somebody because of their color. But if you discriminate against somebody because of their ideas, ideas should be scrutinized. And if they're bad ideas, they should be discriminated against. It's called discernment. And
we have this coming Tuesday, the biggest opportunity in the next 4 years is to be able to make that discernment and vote. And we urge everyone this coming Tuesday to get out there and vote. This topic is front and center in the agenda because certainly we didn't have time to talk about it today about how Hillary has supported these limitations on speech. And Deborah, I'll give you about 30 seconds for closing comments, and I'm going to turn it back over to Lance. He's got less than a minute. Okay. Well, I will just say that, remind everyone that free speech is important for our national security. I will say that Loretta Lynch and other attorney generals have falsely claimed that using anti-Muslim rhetoric is a civil rights violation, a human rights violation, threatening to prosecute it. But they've gotten backlash, and that's why they weren't able to. And if they win, then the laws are going to chip away. There might be prosecutions. It might be deemed hate speech. It might be deemed a civil rights violation. Once free speech goes, as Lance said, then all of the rest of our freedoms will follow. So we have to be vigilant, not just go vote. Bring 3 of your friends. Educate yourself. Educate your family.
families. And as Roy said, check those textbooks because they are rewriting history as I speak. And I want to thank you very much for having me today, Roy.
Thanks, Deborah. Lance?
Deborah, thank you so much. It's as if you were on the first hour. You fell right in there. God bless you and all you're doing, Deborah. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. God bless you. We'd love to have you back again. See, there you go,
Thank
Roy.
you very much. I'd love to come back.
Thank you,
I appreciate your
Deborah.
show.
You keep the fight up, girl. Keep it up.